The judgment before the truth asterisk, the iron chains felt colder than the stone floor beneath her knees, and the silence in the throne room was heavier than any weight the guards had placed on her wrists. The human mother kept her head lowered, not because she felt guilty, but because she had learned long ago that looking powerful men in the eyes often invited cruelty instead of mercy. Around her, nobles whispered, guards shifted their spears, and torches flickered against the black walls of the ancient hall. At the far end, seated upon a throne carved from dark obsidian and bone, sat the vampire king. His presence alone filled the room, tall, unmoving, feared by all. His eyes, pale and ancient, rested on her with suspicion sharpened by grief. To him she was nothing more than another poor human accused of betrayal. Only 3 nights earlier, fire had torn through the royal wing. Smoke had filled the corridors, alarms rang too late, and chaos ruled the castle meant to be untouchable. When it ended, the king's young son had survived, but barely. And when the guards found the human woman near the prince's chambers, her clothes stained with blood and her pockets filled with forbidden healing salves, the court decided her guilt instantly. Poor humans were always blamed first. They were easy targets. She had no family, no title, no one to speak for her. Now she knelt alone, awaiting judgment. The vampire king finally spoke, his voice calm but deadly, echoing through the hall. He accused her of theft, of trespassing, of violating sacred laws meant to protect royal blood. Each word felt like a blade cutting closer to her end. Still, she did not beg. She had begged once before in her life, long ago, and it had not saved the child she loved. This time she chose silence. When asked to defend herself, she lifted her head just enough to say quietly that she regretted nothing. The room erupted in murmurs. To show no fear before the vampire king was seen as arrogance or madness. As the king prepared to deliver his sentence, a single step echoed across the hall. Captain of the guard moved forward, his armor catching the firelight. He was a man known for loyalty, not interruption. The tension sharpened as he asked permission to speak. The king's eyes narrowed. Disobedience in this room often ended in death. Yet something in the captain's face, urgency mixed with resolve, made the king pause. After a long moment, he allowed it. The captain turned, not toward the crowd, but toward his king, his voice steady and loud enough for all to hear. He said the words that froze the entire throne room in shock. He said she was not a thief. He said she was the mother who saved the king's son. The human mother closed her eyes as gasps filled the hall. The truth she had tried to bury now stood exposed. The vampire king stiffened on his throne, centuries of certainty cracking in a single breath. For the first time since the fire, doubt entered his eyes. And in that moment, as judgment turned into silence, the fate of a powerless human woman and a powerful immortal king became forever entwined. The truth behind the chains, the throne room, did not erupt into chaos the way the human mother expected. Instead, it fell into a deep, stunned silence, as if even the torches were holding their breath. The vampire king remained seated, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the arms of the throne as the captain's words echoed through his mind. A mother who saved his son. Those words struck him harder than any rebellion or blade ever had. He looked again at the woman kneeling in chains, really looked this time. And for the first time he noticed how thin she was, how her hands trembled not from fear but from exhaustion, how her eyes carried a grief far older than the crime she was accused of. The king raised one hand, silencing the whispers before they could grow. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than before, but far more dangerous. He ordered the captain to explain everything, slowly and without omission. The guards stiffened. The nobles leaned forward. The human mother kept her gaze lowered, her heart pounding, knowing that once the truth was spoken, there would be no turning back. The captain began with the night of the fire, describing the confusion, the smoke, the screams echoing through the corridors. He told them how the prince's chambers had been left unguarded in the chaos, how assassins had slipped through the shadows, meant to protect royal blood. Then he spoke of what the guards found when they arrived too late. Not a thief fleeing with stolen goods, but a human woman shielding the king's son with her own body. He described her burned hands, the deep cuts on her arms, The way she had used Forbidden's healing salves not to steal power, but to stop the bleeding long enough to save a life. The room stirred uneasily. Forbidden's magic was a crime. Yes, but using it to save a royal child was something else entirely. The vampire king's gaze flicked toward his son, seated beside the throne, pale and silent. The boy's eyes were fixed on the kneeling woman, filled with recognition and fear. Slowly, painfully, the child spoke. He said her name. One small word, trembling but undeniable. He said she stayed when everyone else ran. He said she sang to him to keep him awake while the fire burned. That she told him mothers never leave their children behind. The words shattered what remained of the king's certainty. Memories rose unbidden in the vampire king's mind, his own lost queen. Her final act of shielding their child, the way love demanded sacrifice without hesitation. His anger wavered, replaced by something far more dangerous to a ruler like him: guilt. He realized he had already passed judgment long before the trial began, blinded by fear and grief. The chains on the woman's wrists suddenly looked less like justice and more like shame. He ordered the guards to remove her chains. The sound of iron hitting stone rang through the hall, final and symbolic. When she stood, unsteady but proud, the vampire king rose from his throne for the first time that night. He did not apologize. Kings rarely did. But when he looked at her, there was no longer suspicion in his eyes, only respect, confusion, and a question he was not yet ready to speak aloud. And in that fragile moment, something dangerous and unexpected began to grow between a powerful, immortal king and a human mother, who had already proven she would give everything to protect what she loved. Under the same roof, worlds apart, the human mother was moved from the dungeon to a quiet chamber near the inner wing, a place reserved for honored guests and wounded soldiers. The irony was not lost on her. Only hours ago she had been kneeling in chains, preparing herself for death. Now servants bowed as they passed her, unsure whether to fear her or respect her. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements careful, as if one wrong step might return her to the cold stone floor of the throne room. Power shifted quickly inside castles, and she had learned never to trust it. The vampire king ordered healers to tend to her wounds, but he did not visit her that first night. Instead, he stood outside his son's chamber, watching the boy sleep peacefully for the first time since the fire. Every breath the child took felt like a quiet accusation. The king replayed the captain's words again and again, then the boy's trembling voice saying her name. He had ruled empires without doubt, crushed rebellions without mercy, yet a single human woman had unsettled him more than any enemy ever had. That disturbed him deeply. The next morning he summoned her. She entered the solar slowly, dressed in simple, borrowed clothes, her hands folded to hide the scars that still burned. The king stood by the tall window, his back to her, the light outlining his powerful form. For a long moment neither spoke. When he finally turned, his expression was not cruel, but guarded. He told her she would remain in the castle until the full investigation ended. It sounded like mercy, but it was still a command. She nodded, accepting it without complaint. Days passed, and the castle began to change in small, almost invisible ways. The prince asked for her by name. He refused food until she sat nearby. He slept better when she was close. The vampire king observed this from a distance, torn between gratitude and fear. He had built walls around his heart after losing his queen, believing love was a weakness enemies could exploit. Yet this human woman had walked straight through those walls without ever trying. She never asked for reward. She never demanded safety or comfort. When servants insulted her behind closed doors, she endured it silently. When nobles looked at her with thinly veiled contempt, she lowered her head and moved on. But when the prince cried out in fear from a nightmare, she was always there, steady and calm, whispering comfort like a true mother would. The king noticed everything. He noticed how she treated his son not as a fragile royal heir, but as a child deserving dignity. He noticed how she spoke to him honestly, never flattering, never manipulating. One evening, he found her in the garden at dusk, standing alone among dying roses. She spoke without turning, telling him she never planned to stay in his world. She had only wanted to save a child. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any accusation. In that quiet garden under fading light, the vampire king felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, not desire, not yet, but a deep respect that frightened him more than hatred ever could, because respect led to trust. And trust, he knew, could change everything. When the past comes for the present asterisk, the fragile calm that had settled over the castle did not last. It never did. Power always attracted shadows, and the moment the human mother's position shifted from prisoner to protected, resentment began to grow in the darker corners of Ashenfall. Servants whispered that a human woman had bewitched the king. Nobles muttered that royal blood was being dishonored by mercy. Even among the guards there were those who believed kindness was weakness. The vampire king sensed it the same way. He sensed approaching war, and his instincts warned him that danger had not truly passed. The first sign came when the human mother was denied access to the prince's chamber without explanation. The child cried, confused and frightened, and no amount of orders from lesser officials seemed to change the decision. When the vampire king learned of it, his anger was swift and cold. He summoned those responsible, reminding them that his word was law. Yet even as obedience returned, the message was clear. Someone was testing how far his protection extended. Someone was daring him to choose. That night, the human mother was cornered in a narrow corridor by a noblewoman who spoke with polite cruelty, accusing her of ambition, of manipulation, of knowing her place too well. The insults were sharp, designed to provoke fear. The human mother listened silently, as she always had, until the noblewoman threatened the prince's safety in the same careless tone one might threaten a servant's job. Something inside the human mother hardened. She spoke then, calmly but firmly, saying she feared no punishment, but she would never allow harm to come to a child. The noblewoman laughed, unaware she was being watched. The vampire king stepped from the shadows. His presence crushed the corridor into silence. He dismissed the noblewoman with a single sentence that stripped her of rank and influence, not through rage, but through certainty. The punishment was swift, public, and undeniable. The court watched as instant karma unfolded before them. For the first time, they understood that the king's protection was not temporary, nor emotional, it was absolute. The human mother had not asked for justice, but it was delivered all the same. Later, the king found her trembling in the prince's chamber, trying to hide the fear she had carried for years. He told her she would never stand alone in his castle again. The words surprised them both. He was not used to offering reassurance, and she was not used to receiving it. In that moment, the distance between ruler and servant narrowed, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous. Trust. As days passed, the prince's health improved beyond expectation. He laughed more, spoke more, and walked a few steps with assistance, something healers had declared impossible. The court whispered of miracles. The vampire king watched with a mixture of hope and disbelief. He began to wonder if saving his son had not been a single act, but an ongoing one rooted not in magic, but in love and patience. And as the human mother stood beside the child she had saved, the vampire king realized the truth he had been avoiding. Power could protect kingdoms, but only compassion could heal them. And the woman he once judged as nothing was slowly changing everything he believed about strength, justice, and his own guarded heart, a choice that cannot be undone by the time. The full moon rose over Ashenfall Keep. The truth could no longer be hidden. The human mother was no longer just a guest under protection. She had become a presence woven into the daily rhythm of the castle. Servants looked to her for quiet guidance. Guards trusted her near the prince without question. And the child himself clung to her with a devotion that no decree could command. Each of these changes tightened the pressure around the vampire king, forcing him to confront a reality he had spent centuries avoiding. His heart was no longer untouched. The court demanded answers. Some nobles argued that allowing a human woman such influence weakened the crown. Others feared what would happen if the people learned that royal blood had been saved not by ancient magic, but by a poor mortal mother. The king listened in silence as they debated her fate as if she were an object, not a person. When he finally spoke, the room stilled. He reminded them that the crown existed to protect life, not pride. It was the first time many had heard him speak with conviction rather than command. That night, the king called the human mother to the high balcony overlooking the city. Below them, thousands of lights flickered like stars fallen to earth. He asked her why she had truly risked her life for his son. She did not speak of destiny or reward. She told him about the child she had lost years ago, about the emptiness that never healed, about the instinct that drove her to run toward danger when others fled. Her voice did not tremble, but her hands did. The king listened, silent and still, realizing that her strength was born from pain, not ambition. In return, he spoke of his own loss of the queen he had loved, of how her death had taught him to rule through fear rather than compassion. Admitting this felt like tearing armor from his chest. Yet for the first time in centuries he did not regret the vulnerability. Between them an understanding formed, quiet and unspoken. There was no declaration, no promise, just the awareness that something irreversible had begun. When another attempt was made to remove the human mother from the castle under the guise of security, the vampire king ended the debate forever. He publicly declared her under royal protection, not as a servant, but as family to the crown. Gasps echoed through the hall. It was an act without precedent, one that could not be undone without breaking the king's own authority. Instant karma followed swiftly. Those who had plotted against her were stripped of power and cast out, while those who had shown kindness were elevated. The prince took his first unassisted steps that same day, reaching for her hand with a smile that broke even the hardest hearts in the court. The king watched, emotion tightening his chest, understanding at last that miracles often arrived disguised as ordinary people. As the human mother stood beside the vampire king, no longer beneath him but beside him, the future of the kingdom quietly shifted. Love had not yet been spoken, but respect had already changed the course of fate. The crown learns to bow the day. The human mother was brought before the court again. It was not in chains. She walked freely beside the vampire king, her steps steady, her head held high, though she wore no jewels and claimed no title. The hall that once judged her now watched in silence, unsure whether to fear her or honor her. The king stood before his people and spoke not as an immortal ruler, but as a father who had nearly lost everything. He told them the truth that strength without compassion had nearly destroyed his family, and that a woman with nothing but kindness had saved what power could not. He announced that the human mother would remain within the royal household, not as a servant, but as the guardian of his son and an advisor to the crown in matters of the people. It was a decision rooted not in romance but in respect, and it carried far greater weight because of it. Some nobles protested, but their voices were weak. The kingdom had already seen what justice looked like when guided by humility. The people, hearing the story spread beyond the castle walls, celebrated not the king's mercy, but the woman's courage. The prince's recovery became a symbol throughout the land. Where healers had failed and magic had broken, patience and love had succeeded. The human mother continued to care for him as she always had, never using her new position for privilege. She taught him kindness before authority, empathy before command. The vampire king watched these moments from a distance, realizing that this was the future his kingdom needed. Even if it frightened him, over time the bond between them deepened quietly. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic vows. Instead, there were shared silences, thoughtful conversations, and the understanding that they had both been shaped by loss. When the king placed his cloak around her shoulders one cold evening, it was not a claim but a promise of protection freely given. She accepted it without fear, knowing she was no longer alone in a world that once judged her harshly. The court changed. Laws softened, punishments became fairer. The weak found voices where they once found only walls. The vampire king learned that ruling did not mean standing above everyone, but standing with them. And in doing so, he earned a loyalty deeper than fear ever could. When asked by his advisors what title the human mother should hold, the king answered simply that some roles needed no name. She was proof that dignity was not granted by crowns, but revealed through actions. The kingdom remembered her not as a thief, nor even as a savior, but as the woman who reminded an immortal ruler how to be human again. In the end, justice was served not through punishment, but through transformation. The powerless were protected. The arrogant were humbled, and love, slow, patient, and unspoken, found its place without forcing itself into the light. And the lesson carried far beyond Ashenfall: never judge a soul by its status, for the greatest strength often walks unnoticed until the moment it saves everything.